Hello, everyone. Today I just wanted to speak about a story that I found pretty interesting. I had not read it before. It is really long, so buckle in. I'll try to do my best to summarize some of it. It is the story of the Fairy Witch. This is a true story, and it follows a woman named Bridget Cleary, who was born February 19th, 1867, and she died in March 1895. And she was Irish. And it's important to remember before we start this that Ireland was considered the last place in Europe that persecuted women, majority women, for the crimes of witchcraft. It is also considered to be the last place that people were burned at the stake for being witches, which, as we know, did happen rarely, but it did happen in Europe, and it did not happen here in North America. And you may be thinking to yourself, that seems pretty late for the whole witch craze. And it is. That's quite late. But as I said, Ireland was one of the last places to really continue the witch craze. They stayed in it for quite some time. However, this story is special because Bridget Cleary was not a typical victim of this witch craze. At this time, witchcraft was illegal and punishable by death. And the person who was killed was seen as the guilty party. Therefore, no one who committed any of these murders to anyone during what we call the burning times were ever charged with a crime because they were the innocent ones, supposedly. So Bridget Cleary, she was not killed by her town in which she lived for being a witch. Instead, she was killed by her husband, and he killed her in what he described as an exorcism. He said that it was in the process of an exorcism because he believed that she was a changeling and was not truly his wife. Quick summary here: a changeling is a spirit that replaces a person and takes on their life and looks just like them. So he was convinced that this has happened to his wife for whatever reasons. He decided this is not really his wife, this is a fairy called a changeling that has taken over, and he wanted to get her back. So he decided to exorcise the changeling from her, and as you see, that's very contradictory to what we believe about changelings and to what I just said. Changelings are typically a totally different entity separate from your body, and that was the case here culturally at the time from what I have found in Irish research. However, probably because of the influence of Christianity, I suppose he thought of changelings in the way that one would think of a demon and demonic possession. So that's why they tried an exorcism to pull the changeling from her. Now, after he killed her, he was arrested and charged with her murder, and he was convicted, and he did serve a prison sentence for it. He admitted to what he did. Unfortunately, but her story isn't completely unique. Things like this did happen quite a bit throughout history, not just during what we call the burning times. And I'm gonna read a little bit from a book here. So if my voice starts to sound kind of like an automaton, that's why. I'm reading from the Encyclopedia of Witchcraft by Judica Isles to try to give you some of the information here. One thing I thought was interesting was is that, you know, she married Michael Cleary, who was her husband, when she was only 20 years old. And that was like August 5th of 1887. And they immediately moved in together, and they lived in a house with Bridget's mother, and her mother died 1 year exactly before Bridget died, and that was in 1894. And what's interesting is she was left in the house with her husband, but also with, I believe it was her own father, who would later be implicated in her death as well. So she was left all alone, the sole woman of the home. And in the court testimony, her father, you know, was quoted as saying, "Don't you know it's with an old witch that I am sleeping?" So you can just see how convinced he was that Bridget was indeed not human, that she was some kind of fae or otherworldly being, that she was no longer Bridget. And what I think what's interesting too is that Bridget's mother, but as well Michael's own mother, were both said to be fairy doctors. And a fairy doctor is kind of like a witch doctor. They are a person in the community that is, you know, like a shaman, like a witch, like an herbalist. They come in communion with the fae and, you know, provide services. And both of their mothers were fairy doctors. And supposedly, Bridget Cleary was in training to become a fairy doctor herself during this process, which may have, you know, scared maybe Michael, and maybe that's, you know, why he came to the conclusions that he did. Now, Bridget, I think it's important to note in this time period especially, Bridget was not just a housewife. Bridget was very much an entrepreneur. She sewed clothing, she sold eggs, she grew herbs, she had a lot of side businesses, a lot of side hustles that involved a lot of sewing and the selling of goods that would come from the land and from animals. And she made her own money, and she was allowed to keep that money for herself. So I think that possibly could be, you know, you never know, but that could have been a factor into what happened to her as well, is that she was creating her own dowry, so to speak. And, you know, money and success can breed greed and jealousy among partners. And, you know, after she died, the town, members of the town, like her friends and her neighbors and members of her own family, were interviewed for the court. And they all said that she was, like, very defiant, that she did not like to take the traditional roles of a woman. So, again, just adding to this reputation we have of her, you know, that she was just a very unusual woman for her time. A lot of people did come forward and say that her mother did have a reputation for being a fairy doctor, or quote, actually one of them said, quote, a fairy expert. And people were somewhat afraid of the family because of that, but they did also, they also did accept the services of the family as well for, enchantments and spell breakings and, things of that nature, fairy healings. And supposedly, again, according to these neighbors of hers, they would see her coming and going at strange hours and would see her going out to the woods by herself in the mornings and at night alone, which is unusual for the time, especially for a woman. And they said that this started immediately after her mother passed away. So they assumed that she was heading to the forests at these twilight hours to try to communicate with the spirit of her mother. They believed that maybe she was still receiving her fairy training directly now from the fairies, since her mother was passed away, or that she was receiving this special training from the spirit of her deceased mother still. Like that even in death, her mother was still training her as a fairy doctor, which is very interesting. And then, of course, some people took a more like apologetic approach or empathetic approach, I guess, sympathetic, where they said, well, maybe she was completely enchanted by the fairies and brainwashed, much like her husband was saying here. Maybe it was this, none of this was her intention. Maybe this is all the fairies enchanting her. But either way, it's Michael's fault. But what's interesting is that as a child, Michael, his mother, who was also named Bridget and who was also a fairy doctor, witnessed his mother running away for 3 days. She ran away from the family, and when she came back, it was said that she had run away to go live in the woods by herself for 3 days because it's what the fairies wanted. She had to go away for 3 days and be with the fairies in the forest and commune with them. And then she came back. But, she didn't tell her family, I suppose, about this or anything. She just upped and left for 3 days while Michael was just a small child. And this had a huge impact on him. It was well known that this disturbed him and that it was a painful memory for him. And I think this is probably what started his contempt for the idea of fairies and the idea of working with fairies. And I think the fact that the woman he wound up marrying was also the daughter of a fairy doctor, she herself was becoming a fairy doctor probably, and her name was also Bridget. These are probably huge triggers for him. That brought up a lot of unresolved emotional trauma. But of course, back then, these trauma like that would not be addressed. And it was during Yule, quote, Yuletide of 1894, that friends and family started to notice that there was something going on between Michael and Bridget. They seemed to be in a sort of a quarrel. Because I guess at this time, Bridget was becoming more defiant and would not bow to Michael's whims and would not, kind of submit to his, dominance in the household, which of course is what any man was told should be happening, at that time culturally. But she would not submit to him. And so he started to think, well, this isn't my wife. This is a fairy that has replaced her. And, after her death, there were a lot of witnesses that came forward that said that Michael was constantly threatening Bridget. He threatened to burn her several times, to literally set her on fire if she went back to the woods and he found out. So there's that. On February 1st, which of course we as pagans know is a holiday, is a Sabbath, she was observed on February 1st, 1895, on the first anniversary of her mother's death, in the woods. She was observed there by several people in the woods at what was called a fairy fort. which was just a set of ruins of some building in the woods that had become overgrown. And they called that a fairy fort because they believed it was inhabited by fae. And she was seen there at the fairy fort on February 1st, on the anniversary of her mother's death, who was a fairy doctor. So, they saw that as, a little spooky. Of course, we as modern pagans here and magicians and witches and the like would not see that as scary. We ourselves would probably be joining her in doing that. And then it was on March 6th, 1895, that Bridget returned home late in the afternoon, complaining that she was feeling pretty bad and that she had been out all day selling eggs. And she had a lot of aches and pains and chills, and she was very irritable and demonstrated some memory loss. And these were all red flags at the time for what was called a fairy illness, and were also literal textbook definitions of what happens to a person when they've been abducted, possessed, or otherwise replaced by a fairy. So, with that backing, the family did take her to, when by the family I mean Michael, did take her to a hospital. He requested a house call from the physician, and it took the doctor 4 days to get there, but he did, and he said that she just seemed to have bronchitis, that it was just bronchitis, and that Michael didn't accept that as her diagnosis, and he said, no, this can't be true. I refuse to accept that. He'd already made up his mind that she had been, abducted or possessed by fairies. And he said, look at her. She's even 2 inches taller than she used to be. And that is a little flag here because, if you look into fairy mythology, fairy lore from the European, area, like the Celtic area, you know that typically if you were trying to discern whether someone is a human or a fairy, it's because something will be slightly different. Their ears may be pointed, they may be slightly taller, slightly smaller, their ears may be their eyes may be a different color, maybe their nails are long. It's always something very, 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 very subtle. But there's always a slight difference between a human and a fairy. And also in terms of changelings. What I mean is, on their own, fairy are a lot of the times described as looking just like a person, just slightly different, something abnormal. So maybe they have a color of eyes that is not normal for humans, and that's how you know it's a fairy. But also, when they are taking on the guise of a human, it is said, most of the stories that I have found, it is said that the change is not completely perfect. That again, you will see some kind of tell that this is a fairy and not a human. And so he was convinced that she was 2 inches taller, and that was his flag for her being a fairy, along with all of these symptoms, which we can probably assume the doctor was correct. It probably was just bronchitis, but this is the late 1800s, and this is Ireland. This is rural Ireland. So fairy beliefs are still very strong. So for 9 days after the doctor's visit, Bridget lay there really sick, and a lot of people came in and out of the house supposedly during these 9 days to see Bridget. Family, neighbors, extended relatives, like a lot of people decided to show up and see her for whatever reasons. And during these 9 days, Michael was like putting the word out all over town that he was looking for some help from the church or just from the community, that he needed help from someone who could definitively come and say, yes, this is fairy possession and or fairy abduction. And allegedly, again, this is a quote that came from a neighbor during the court hearings, quote, Michael could be heard crying out, "If I had my mother, I would not be this way." So again, we're just getting a lot of flags here about the mental state of Michael. We can infer a lot of things, I think, by looking into Michael's history and how he got to this point, and about what he would ultimately do to Bridget. What's important, I think, too, is that Michael himself said that 9 was a magical number. And, he said that he believed that, probably this is something, by the way, that he learned from his fairy doctor mother, that if a person is abducted and or possessed by a fairy, you have exactly 9 days to cure them, or they are lost forever. Now, there are a lot of stories showing that that's not always necessarily true. In other folk tales and such that we have about fairy abduction and or possession, some people can stay away for years, like 7 years or more, and then show back up again. But, as is folklore, it's, convoluted and expansive and contradictory. And, for him and his family and his mother's fairy doctor practice, maybe 9 was true. That was the template they were working off of. So after these 9 days, it was over for him. He thought, this is it. There's nothing else I can do. And, he had reached out to the Catholic Church at this time to help, because at the time, the Celtic Catholic Church, which is its own specific sect, the Celtic Catholic Church, at the time did exorcise fairies and did openly believe in fairies, because you basically said that a fairy was a synonym for a demon. So that is wordage that they understood. But it didn't seem to be happening for him. But eventually 2 priests did show up. And, a priest met up twice. I said that backwards. 1 priest did come forward. And he spoke to Bridget twice for over 20 minutes. And he said that she was completely coherent, very intelligent, and he said that she just seemed to have, quote, brain fever. And he decided to administer her last rites just in case that she didn't come out of this sickness, because he saw it pretty much as the doctor did. Oh, she just has, a sickness, and it's not going very well for her. So he was going to read her last rites, and supposedly during it, she refused to swallow the communion wafer, and that, was a red flag for him. And apparently there were other people in the room, some neighbors and nosy people, and they also confirmed that she refused to eat it. And one person said that she actually had it in her mouth, but she spit it out, and in disgust, quote. And of course they thought, oh, well, then she's definitely possessed, because she's refusing, this symbolic body of Christ. And so this is when things got pretty dark. This is when Bridget was killed. I mean, let's just be blunt. So at this point, another person did come forward, a relative of Bridget, named John Dunn, who was also a fairy doctor. So it ran in her family. It's important to note that there are 2 kinds of fairy doctors at this time period. There are kind of what we could call fairy magicians, which are what we've been talking about this entire time. They work with the fae. But then there are also fairy doctors, which are more like fairy fighters or fairy exorcists. They work against the fae, but both are called fairy doctors. So it's 2 approaches to working with the fae, good and bad. And John was definitely the latter. He did not work with the fae. He was a fairy doctor that worked against the fae. And so he prescribed an herbal formula for his family member, Bridget, which was called, quote, the Seven Sisters Kill or Cure. Infer there what you think that herbal formula does. However, it did neither. Bridget was given the formula. She did not die, but she also was not cured of her sickness. And so then Michael Cleary purchased an herbal cure from someone else, we don't know who, called the 9-in-1 cure, which was supposedly, again with his fascination with the number 9, it was supposedly 9 times stronger, hence the name too, than the Seven Sisters mixture. And, you know, during this time, she was not being fed. She was barely being given water. So her sickness was just getting worse and worse and worse. And he took that as the fairy taking more control of her, not the fact that he was starving her and dehydrating her. Now, Bridget was in and out of consciousness and lucidness during this time, obviously, but she was constantly quoted as saying that she was requesting the police to be called, that she needed to be removed from, you know, her home and from Michael, but this was never done. Her wishes were never honored. And finally, a 16-year-old neighbor stood in the corner of the room holding a candle for light one night, and John Dunn, again, this family member who was also a fairy doctor, but of the negative kind, was, you know, holding back Bridget's hair, pinning her to the bed. And 2 other men who we do not know were also holding her down. And Michael attempted to force Bridget to swallow the 9-in-1 cure, yelling, quote, "Swallow it, you devil. Take it, you old witch." They pried her mouth open, and it said that it took 6 men to pour this liquid down her throat, but that they did. And this is all according to this 16-year-old neighbor who was holding the candle in the corner. And after she took it, the family waited 3 hours for a change, and nothing happened. So then they decided to introduce the element of fire to try to spook the fairy out of Bridget's body. And this was midnight on March 15th. And Bridget was dressed up in her finest clothing that she had, including a red petticoat, in order that she could go amongst the people. And by the people, they meant the fairies. And why they would dress her up for this, I don't know, unless they knew that they ultimately were trying to kill her. But they dressed her up very nice in case something were to happen. And they threw urine all over her body, probably their own. She was choked. She was force-fed the urine with a mixture of herbs. She was pushed onto the ground from the bed, which supposedly, according to this 16-year-old neighbor, he saw her head strike against the floor. And then they ripped her clothes off, and she was shoved over a grate that was in front of the fireplace, and that must have been terrible for her. And according to this witness, there was also a low fire burning in the fireplace, so he knew that the grill must have been hot. She was threatened with a hot iron poker. You know, fairies allegedly, in Celtic belief, you know, they do not like iron and fire. So that's why that choice was made. But then he said that Michael Cleary was seen pouring the contents of a can of oil over his wife and then setting her on fire. There were 2 women present, and they attempted to put the fire out, but Michael kept pushing them away, threatening to, quote, roast them as well. He poured more oil over her body, according to another witness, and he said that he wasn't burning his wife, he was burning a witch who would go up the chimney. Now, yet another witness, this one's named, her name was Minnie Simpson, she told the police after this that the family did indeed believe that the person was not Bridget, but a witch. So again, we're having, synonyms here of fairy and witch. Now, it is important to note that in the 17th century, that would be the 1800s, as we are here, in England specifically, but I suppose in all of Europe, I have read that the term fairy was interchangeable for a pagan practitioner or a witch. They called them fairies. So that's important to note. It was also, fun fact, during the 17th century, that fairy was first recorded as a slur for homosexuals as well. So, there you go. So that's why here you can see that they're going back and forth by calling her a fairy and calling her a witch. To them, at this time period, it's the same thing. So, so Minnie Simpson said that, they believed that she was a witch / a fairy, and that, what I thought was crazy, that Minnie kind of tries to exonerate herself. She said, yeah, I was there, I watched it all happen, and while I didn't stop them from doing anything, I didn't help either. Like, she was literally quoted as saying that, as if that made it better. Now, at this point, Bridget is, suffering. She's on fire. But people started to think, oh, she must be cured now. We've burned this evil out of her. So people started leaving. And after they put Bridget out, they did put her out while she was still alive. And they put her out, and people started to leave. And there was a lot of witnesses that said they left because Bridget was clearly still alive after she was put out, which is very disturbing. And while they do say that she was alive, it was a few days later, on March 22nd, 1895, that her body was discovered 1,300 yards from the Cleary home, wrapped in a sheet and buried in a shallow grave. It was said that her entire back and lower abdomen had been burned down to the bone. Her internal organs were visible. Her right hand was severely burned, but that her face, hair, breasts, shoulders, neck, legs... Sorry about that. I don't know why that's important, but they did feel the need to point out everything that was not burnt. So, it was, confirmed by a doctor that she died due to burns, extensive burns. And 11 people were arrested in connection with the murder of Bridget, including the 16-year-old neighbor who stood there quietly with the candle, who recounted all of this to us. Now, what's sad is I think it's pretty easy to infer that, Bridget, yes, she was most definitely what today we would call a witch or a pagan. She was most definitely someone who was a member of the fairy faith. And today, we would celebrate her for that. We in the pagan community. But at this time, obviously, that was not the case because the Roman Catholic Church was king at this time. And, she's a victim of her time, which is very unfortunate. A lot of this was brought on not just by her most likely having bronchitis, but because she was a very assertive woman. And there are so many stories of this throughout history, of women being women, just being normal people. But because they are being opinionated and normal, they were deemed as, evil and punished accordingly. So, from what I was able to find, these 11 people, they all were charged, but they didn't all go to jail. Michael did go to jail, but I believe that he did not die in jail. He did get out. Sorry, I was reading more to see if there was more information about what did happen to him. Yeah, so he served 15 years in prison out of a 20-year sentence for manslaughter, not murder, which is important to point out. There was absolutely zero discussion in the court trial of fairies. None of that was brought up, which is so whack. And her body was refused to be released to her family. And she was buried by 4 policemen one night who read some stuff, probably from the Bible for her while they buried her. And she was buried in a Roman Catholic cemetery. And it was not released to the family because obviously the family was crazy. And what is unfortunate is that, so she was buried beside her mother, but it was in an unmarked grave. Today, there are 2 stones that sit there, but I think, from what I understand, the grave is still unmarked. I just think it's all very unfortunate. I mean, yes, he did serve 15 years for her killing her, but he was not charged with murder. He was charged with manslaughter, which is a much less severe charging. And none of the superstition of their fairy beliefs were brought up in court. And to only serve 15 years to do something that was so premeditated and malicious is so whack. But anywho, I bring that up because I thought it was fascinating. And, she was immortalized in a fairy tale, like a nursery rhyme, that was sung for a long time by, children. And it was kind of like malicious in a way, but not completely. Like, a part of it was, "Are you a witch? Are you a fairy? Are you the wife of Michael Cleary?" And it's just very sad. It's almost kind of mocking. Now, it is important to note that after her death, in the years following, people did start to take a very sympathetic approach to her. And they did completely find disgust in Michael. His reputation in the town was completely diminished for the rest of his life. And I guess that's some penance. But a lot of people did also still believe that while they had sympathy for what happened to her, they still thought it was kind of her fault for meddling with fairies, quote. Anywho, I just thought it was an interesting story that I just came across while I was reading. And also really sad. So, there you go. A little true crime, pagan true crime there for you.